Have a good day.
I know that with how algorithmically driven the modern internet is, it is exhausting. Believe me, I'm often left feeling apathetic and annoyed by the whole thing sometimes. But occasionally, that algorithm can be useful. And recently I was just on YouTube the other day, just mindlessly scrolling through things, and I got a trailer for a game, an upcoming indie game. It was called VIVIDLOPE. And I thought this game looked like the bee's knees. And bees have 6 knees. Is that what the expression is referring to? I'm a sucker for this aesthetic. I'm sure it has a proper name, but I'm gonna call it Dreamcast Core. Very Y2K, feels like something that would have been on the Sega Dreamcast. Actually reminded me of another game for the Dreamcast, Choo Choo Rocket, which I primarily played on the Game Boy Advance, but that doesn't matter right now. I just like that game. And this game reminded me of that game. So yeah, I thought this game looked like something that I would enjoy. It seemed like to be my kind of thing. So, the serotonin levels were going or something, and I was excited to play this game. I then forgot the name of the game and had no idea what to type into a search engine in order to find it. Technically speaking, it was in my YouTube history, but this had been a few days, so it would have been a lot of scrolling. I just watched a lot of junk on this website. Good stuff too, but also junk. Distraught, but I moved on. I figured it would eventually find its way back to me. And then one day I was going through my music to kind of see, I was curious about who was involved with some of my favorite compilation albums. And so I was looking through that. I was looking for the artists. Could you word this better? I was looking at the individuals that were involved to see what else they had done. There we go. Nailed it. Perfect. If you're curious to whom I was specifically looking up, I was looking at the people involved with Sonic the Hedgehog, The Sound of Speed, an Overclocked remix album, I Miss You, Earthbound 2012, which is a collection of songs made from the sounds of Earthbound, and finally, the soundtrack for the fan game Yonoid 2, Enter the Void, which is sincerely one of my favorite little 3D platformers.
I don't mind, I'll make you be okay, but recently everyone says they sing less of me. I could do better if I had energy, feel like I used to be.
Anyways, I was looking at the artists involved in the Yonoid 2 soundtrack, and one of those artists go under the name Baekun, who made this tasty track. They also made a couple more tracks, but this is my favorite from them. It's just so bouncy. Then I looked up to see what else they had been doing, and it turns out they were making music for the game that I forgot the name of. So yeah, that's how VIVIDLOPE got back to me. Kind of a fun journey. If anything, it seems pretty anti-algorithmic for how it got back to me. It wasn't recommended again, it's just I followed up on things that I enjoyed and I was rewarded. There's probably a lesson there. VIVIDLOPE is an arcadey puzzle game. The objective of each level is to turn several tiles a certain color. This is done by simply walking over the tiles. As when walked over, they switch a color. They switch to a color. The color changes. You get it. Usually a tile only needs to be walked over once, but sometimes it might be trickier than that. Sometimes it might have to be walked over multiple times, and sometimes walking over it will revert it back to its former color, so extra care has to be taken. While that's happening, there are various obstacles, such as environmental hazards and enemies that will get in the way. With enemies that look like this, it's hard to get too upset, but believe me, they can be real jerks when they want to be, but the game gives you the ability to be a jerk right back, so it's not totally one-sided. That's the basic premise of the gameplay. I'm kind of glossing over a lot of the finer details, such as what it takes to get the best ranks and what it takes to get 100%, and that can get much more difficult, but it's not a super brutally hard game, honestly. It's just kind of funny that this thing can get so wild when its levels look like this. It's basically grid paper. Check out this level I made. I probably could try to keep talking about the game mechanics in an effort to sell you on the game, but to be honest with you, it is kind of one of those things where someone can look at it and immediately know if it's for them or not. I changed my mind. I'm gonna keep talking about it. Unscripted, I brought this out just for this bit, but there really is no point. I'm going to keep talking about this game for a bit, because I should do a better job. It's going to be unscripted. I'm using nature as my green screen, which I'm sure is working perfectly. I'm really enjoying my time in this game. It does get tricky sometimes, right? Like I'm getting to the later levels. It is throwing a lot at me with the enemy patterns and level designs. and I'm almost like, but then I remember I'm not going for all the ranks. That's like the best rank. What I'm really enjoying about this game, outside of like the look and the vibe, is this gameplay. It's so fun. Like I said, I'm not going for perfect. I am trying to get my best score though. And maybe eventually when I get to the end of the game, I will go for all the ranks, because that's the kind of person I am. But yeah, there is something really satisfying about trying to get every tile in the stage cleared, which is a bit trickier than it seems, because the player only needs to get so many in the stage to complete it. Once it gets to this point, like once the player hits like the quota, it's not 100%, it's like maybe 80% of the tiles are needed to pass the stage. Then the game switches, and now what I'm trying to say.
So what I was trying to communicate there was that getting 100% of the tiles requires forethought, because once you have enough tiles cleared in the stage, then you can't step back on those same tiles without like losing. There's like a timer. No, there's a meter that goes up in the stage called the power meter. I don't fully know what it does. I feel like I should. But basically, you have this meter, and if the player steps on a tile that they've already stepped on before, it goes down. Step out enough, and the level ends, regardless of how many tiles you cleared. So, when trying to get all 100% of the tiles, there needs to be enough forethought to be like, I need to make sure I can either get back to these tiles that I'm skipping right now, or, and this is what I do because I can't think that far ahead, I am like, I will get all the tiles over here before I move on ahead. This is a fun challenge because, again, sometimes there's a bunch of stuff going on, or like the player can undo their progress, so there needs to be like consideration taken. It's a fun challenge. As long as I get 100%, I'm pretty okay with whatever rank I get. Yeah.
But they forget a couple tiles here. Good morning. How you doing today? I haven't called too much attention to it yet, and a better writer than me would have, because it's about to make up the basis of this episode, so I should have done some more foreshadowing. But VIVIDLOPE is an indie game. An indie game is typically developed by a small team or maybe just an individual and doesn't have any funding from a major publisher. Sometimes they'll get funding and backing from like a small publisher, and even sometimes a big publisher, but that's getting a little lost in the weeds. VIVIDLOPE appears to be self-published, and there's a lot of other indie games that are self-published. And also, how sick is it that games can look like this now? How far we've come as a society. Because for a while, a lot of indie games were like pixel-based affairs, and don't get me wrong, I love pixels, I love a good sprite, I even love a bad sprite. It's just for a while that was like kind of like the prevailing trend or prevailing style, if you will, of indie games, to be these pixel-based affairs. And obviously not all of them were. You had games that looked close to the Flash. I just wanted to acknowledge that, yes, browser games in the aughts were indie games, but it seems like that could be like a different discussion. I think there are two reasons for this, and I'm not saying this with like any authority on the subject, so take it with a grain of salt. I was just a schmuck that happened to be there, but here's what I think. One, it seems like the tools available to aspiring indie developers were more geared towards 2D-based development. And by accessible, I mean like financially accessible and maybe like knowledge base accessible, like they weren't too intimidating to get started with. That I just think played into the, lack of 3D indie games. Not that there weren't any 3D indie games, like that's not what I'm saying. Just 2D platformers or top-down, games were just a lot more common to see, and it seems like they were more feasible for people to do at the time. And two, at the time, it was the 8-bit and 16-bit eras that people were really nostalgic for. I'm talking NES, I'm talking Super Nintendo, I'm talking Sega Genesis, Atari 2, why not? I don't know, it was old, people liked it. So the developers who grew up with those games as kids were now adults with the tools to make a game. They realized they could make a game that looked like that. And since people who were also kids back then were nostalgic for that, there would be an audience to buy those games and support the developers. I think the woodpecker's outside. I'll keep recording. There's this woodpecker that lives near here. They're very cute. They're usually here in like the fall, and occasionally they'll like on like the wall outside. And the first time I heard it, I was like, is someone just knocking at my door? But I went outside and then I've never gotten like a super good look at them, but I've gotten like decent looks at them. They're cute. They're not harming anything. Maybe objectively they're harming something, but it's whatever. I think they're cute. I like their presence. I do want to acknowledge real quick that getting an indie game on like consoles was such a different landscape back then. The idea of it was not impossible, but it would require the developer to go to the publisher and convince them to publish their game, which meant they would need to, I don't have an indie physical game, but convincing them to do a case, the cartridge or disc, the manual, the label, the shipping, just all these things. Like the printing of these is significantly more expensive than just dropping a file onto a digital server. And it's not that there weren't indie games coming out during this time. It wasn't impossible to make an indie game and get it out there. It was still possible to upload a game to the internet, for example, but getting a game onto consoles where the average person would find it was significantly more difficult and even risky. Honestly, I'm really curious to find out like how indie games were even developed, but also mostly like published back then in the 90s and early aughts. Maybe there's a book out there or a video. It's just something I would love to learn more about. So if that doesn't exist, I hope people more qualified than me could make it happen. I think that's a really interesting topic to discuss, but I'm getting off track. Well, now we're 10-ish years out from the arbitrary dates I gave earlier, and a lot's changed since then. Those once younger developers, or maybe they weren't young, I shouldn't assume, but regardless, they're older now. And there's now a new generation of people nostalgic for different things. And if you move 10 years forward from the era that those former devs were pulling influence from, that's a bad way to word that. I'm saying basically people were now nostalgic for things like the PlayStation, Nintendo 64, and Dreamcast. Also, naturally, the tools available to indie devs got better and easier to use, kind of. I'm not a developer. I don't know if they actually got easier to use, but they clearly got better because second dimensional games were no longer the only option. We have people now working in the third dimension. And since those indie developers have a different pool of nostalgia or retro appreciation even to pull from, we get games with like this Y2K vibes and low poly models. It's cool. And since there's people now in 2024 who want more of that style, in the same way that people in 2013 wanted something that reminded them of this style, there are people who will buy these games and give money to the developers. Hot dang. All of that is to say that at this point in time, what an indie game can look like is such a much larger range. What they can play like, what they can sound like, what ideas they're playing around with, what emotions they're trying to conjure, what stories they're trying to tell, what experiences they're trying to convey, what mechanics that they're exploring, what genres they're breathing new life into, what playgrounds are they giving players to play in. Basically, there's a lot more creativity going on here in terms of variety, and I'm sure as time goes onward, that variety is only going to get more eclectic, which is super exciting because it makes this passion of mine more colorful to experience. That long-winded part is really just to say that I really like where video games are right now. And a lot of that gratitude does come from indie devs. I think if it was just the AAAs making stuff, if things would get kind of boring, but you know, I don't want to, I'm just saying like indie devs add a lot of color to this medium. And you know, I've hesitated to say this last part because it's a little sappy for even someone like me, but there's so much like love and passion put into these projects, and that shows in the work. It's what makes it's what makes indie games so rich as like an experience usually. And I don't want to romanticize every indie dev right here. There might be financial incentives for some of them, and ideally, I hope that they think that their work can make their money back. This isn't like free for all. It takes time and money to make these things, but you know, I don't think that disqualifies the passion, right? I think that these games are so wonderful and what they want to be, and there's so much variety, and it's all so uncompromised that, yeah, I think it makes the landscape of video games just so much more eclectic or fantastic or wonderful or whatever. It just makes it better, right? It just makes it better. At the time of this upload, I'm still playing through VIVIDLOPE, so maybe I should have waited to make this episode until after I finished the game. Maybe I'd be yapping about something more relevant to the game then, like how even though this is a super wonderful, cool, wonderful world to be in, satisfying gameplay, and how rewarding it is to try to clear all the tiles and get the best score possible. That's what's kept me hooked on the game. It's just, I got this feeling when I was playing the game, independent of the game really, but I got this feeling, right? That how far we've come, how far indie developers have come, right? And what they're able to do, and what they can do, and what possibilities are open. And I really just wanted to take a moment to celebrate that because I think, you know, it makes the world a better place, really, honestly, truly. So, hooray, yeah.